5 words. That's all it takes. 5 words on a government memo and the question just goes away. The journalists back off, the politicians move on, and the people who breathed it, drank it, walked through it, they never even knew that there was a question to ask. No danger to the public. San Francisco, 1950, Hanford, Washington, 1949, St. Louis, 1953, London, 1963, and the South Australian desert, 1956. 5 different cities, 5 different decades, 5 different governments, and in every single case, the same 5-word phrase, or something close to it, showed up in the paperwork after the fact. After the spraying was done, after the fallout had already settled, after the children had already played in the fog. Today we're going to unseal these 5 stories, and by the end, I think you'll understand something that took me a while to accept. This wasn't a series of mistakes, it was a pattern, and it only stopped because people got caught. September 20th, 1950. The Korean War is 3 months old. Senator McCarthy is on television, and just off the coast of San Francisco, a United States minesweeper is doing something it will take 26 years to admit. The ship is 2 miles out from the Golden Gate Bridge. The crew are pointing what looks like an industrial hose towards the city. What comes out of those hoses isn't water. It is a fine mist of 2 bacterial agents, Bacillus globigii and Serratia marcescens. I definitely did not pronounce that right, I am sorry. Serratia is found naturally in soil and water. It produces a distinctive bright red pigment, blood red in fact, which is exactly why the military chose it. If you spray it over a city and then swab surfaces afterwards, those red colonies are impossible to miss on a Petri dish. It is the perfect tracer organism. So the Navy wanted to answer one question. If an enemy submarine surfaced near a port city and released a cloud of biological agent, how far would it spread? Over 6 days, September 20th through to the 27th, the ship sprayed and the Army monitored. 43 sampling stations had been placed around San Francisco and the surrounding suburbs. The results exceeded every expectation. The bacterial cloud spread across the entire city. It crossed the bay. It reached communities 23 miles from the release point. Based on the sampling data, the Army calculated that nearly every one of San Francisco's 800,000 residents had inhaled at least 5,000 bacterial particles. That's within the range of infectivity for anthrax. Now, the military believed Serratia was harmless. That was the whole premise. You could spray it over a city, study the dispersal patterns, and no one would get hurt. 2 weeks later, on October 11th, 11 people checked into Stanford Hospital, which was located in San Francisco at the time, with severe urinary tract infections. All 11 were caused by the same pathogen, Serratia. The hospital had never recorded a single case of it before. 10 in 1 day. His name was Nevin. He was 75 years old, recovering from prostate surgery. The Serratia infection spread to his heart. He developed endocarditis on November 1st, 1950, and he was dead. Stanford's doctors were baffled. They wrote up the outbreak in a medical journal, the first recorded cluster of Serratia infections in a hospital setting. They had no idea where it had come from, but someone at the Navy knew, because years later a microbiologist named Matthew Messelson learned from a lab assistant whose boyfriend had worked at the Navy's biological laboratory in Oakland that the base commander had called an all-hands meeting shortly after the test. He told the staff that a recent experiment had likely killed man, and then he made them a promise. If anyone ever talked about it publicly, the Navy would make sure that person could never find work anywhere in the United States. So the public didn't learn about this until 1976, when a Long Island newspaper called Newsday broke the story. In 1977, the Army admitted to Senate subcommittee hearings that it had conducted 239 open-air biological warfare tests between 1949 and 1969. 80 of them used live bacteria. Edward Nevin's grandson, an attorney, sued the federal government. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court. The family lost, the government was ruled immune. And the official position from the beginning, no danger to the public. 9 months before San Francisco, there was Hanford. In December 1949, the Soviet Union had just detonated its first atomic bomb 3 months earlier. American intelligence was scrambling. They believed the Soviets were rushing their plutonium production, processing irradiated uranium fuel before it had cooled properly, skipping safety protocols to build bombs faster. The Air Force needed to know that if the Soviets were cutting corners, could we detect it from the air? To test that, they needed radioactive material in the atmosphere. A controlled release, high enough to be picked up by airborne instruments. And the Hanford nuclear site in eastern Washington, which had been producing plutonium for America's atomic weapons since 1943, was the obvious place to do it. Now normally, irradiated uranium fuel is cooled for 83 to 101 days before processing to make sure it's nicely marinated and evenly cooked on both sides. This waiting period allows short-lived radioactive isotopes, particularly iodine-131, to decay to manageable levels. For this experiment, they cooled the fuel for just 16 days. Still green, still dangerously radioactive. On the evening of December 2nd, 1949, despite objections from Hanford's own health staff who warned the weather conditions were wrong, the Department of Defense ordered the test to proceed. The filters in the exhaust stacks at Hanford's T plant were switched off, and 1 ton of green uranium fuel was dissolved in acid. The original plan was to release roughly 4,000 curies of iodine-131. Well, they released closer to 8,000, nearly double. To put that into perspective, the 3 Mile Island accident in 1979, the worst commercial nuclear accident in American history at the time, released an estimated 15 curies of iodine-131. The Green Run released over 500 times that amount. No evacuations, no warnings, no advisories about milk or produce. I mean, it was December, and officials later argued that because it was winter, there were no crops being harvested and there were few cows grazing outdoors, so the exposure was minimal, right? But iodine-131 concentrates in the thyroid gland. It travels through dairy, and families in rural Washington drank local milk all year round. At 3 Mile Island, schools were closed. A 20-mile evacuation zone was established. Over 600,000 people were displaced. At Hanford, after the Green Run, people woke up the next morning and went about their lives. They couldn't see it, they couldn't taste it, and the government made damn sure they didn't know about it. The Green Run stayed classified until 1986, 37 years, when a citizen advocacy group called the Hanford Education Action League pried it loose through Freedom of Information requests. And even then, key sections of the official report were blacked out. The names of who authorized it remains classified to this day. Those who lived downwind came to be known as the downwinders. They reported cancer, thyroid disease, miscarriages. In 2005, a lawsuit on behalf of 2,300 affected people resulted in just 2 plaintiffs being awarded compensation, $500,000 between them. And the line in the paperwork, the one that cleared the test to proceed, no ground level danger anticipated. The summer of 1953, St. Louis, Missouri, and the Pruitt-Igoe housing complex, 33 towers of concrete and brick, home to around 10,000 people. 70% of those residents were children under 12. Nearly all of them were black, and in military planning documents obtained decades later through Freedom of Information requests, the neighborhood was described in 2 words: slum district. That description wasn't incidental. It was the point. The Army's Chemical Corps were running a program to test how aerosol agents would disperse over a major American city. St. Louis was selected because its population density, terrain, and river geography made it a close physical analog to Moscow. If you wanted to model what a biological or chemical attack on the Soviet capital might look like, St. Louis, that's your guy. And if you wanted a test site where the subjects were unlikely to have the political power to ask questions, Pruitt-Igoe was your neighborhood. Men in protective suits appeared on rooftops. Motorized blowers were installed on top of buildings. Vehicles with spray nozzles rolled through the streets. And from those devices came a fine, persistent fog. The compound being sprayed was zinc cadmium sulfite, a fluorescent chemical that glows under ultraviolet light, making it easy to track over long distances. Residents were told the Army was testing smoke screens, defensive technology to protect American cities from Soviet radar. Local politicians were never briefed on the actual contents of the spray. James Cadwell, who was a child in Pruitt-Igoe at the time, remembers it vividly. The fog, the chemical taste, running through the mist to cool off in the summer heat. The men in hazmat suits on the rooftop were described to the residents as maintenance workers. "What are maintenance workers doing in hazmat suits?" Cadwell asked, decades later. Here's what the residents didn't know. Cadmium is a known carcinogen. The Army's own top chemist, Philip Leighton, wrote in a 1955 manual that compounds of zinc and cadmium were both known to be poisonous when taken into the human system, and that possibilities of toxic effects had to be considered. Leighton wrote that the Army sprayed it anyway, and the testing continued into the 1960s. The same compound, the same neighborhood. Researcher Lisa Martineau-Taylor, a sociologist who had spent decades investigating the St. Louis tests, had raised a more disturbing possibility. Based on declassified documents, she believes the Army may have mixed radioactive particles with the zinc-cadmium sulfite. She points to decontamination protocols in the records that she says are inconsistent with a chemical tracer alone. The Army denies this, obviously, but key records do remain classified and/or missing. What isn't disputed is the aftermath. Ben Phillips, who grew up in Pruitt-Igoe, watched his mother die of cancer. His sister suffered unexplained convulsions that baffled doctors, convulsions that stopped when the family moved away. Former residents report a litany of cancers, kidney disease, and autoimmune disorders. No comprehensive health study of the affected population has ever been conducted. In September 2023, former residents formed an organization called FACTS, Pruitt-Igoe Historical Accounting, Compensation and Truth Seeking. They are still fighting for recognition. And the Army's official position? A spokesperson told the Associated Press that health assessments had concluded exposure would not pose a health risk. No danger to the public. This one's a little close to home. 1963, the Cold War is at its peak. The Cuban Missile Crisis was just 12 months ago, and inside the British Ministry of Defence, a quiet question is being asked. If someone released a biological agent in the London Underground, how far would it travel? To find out, two scientists from Microbiological Research Establishment at Porton Down, Britain's classified chemical and biological warfare facility, boarded a packed Northern Line train at Collier's Wood Station in South London. As the train moved north toward Tooting Broadway, one of them discreetly dropped a small cardboard carton out of the carriage window. The carton hit the tunnel floor and burst open, releasing millions of Bacillus globigii spores, the same organism that had been sprayed over San Francisco 13 years earlier, chosen because it was considered a safe stand-in for anthrax. The results were, in the ministry's own words, a success. Swabs taken in the days and weeks that followed showed that the spores had spread the full length of the Northern Line. They reached Camden Town, 10 miles from the release point. Every train that passed through the tunnel acted as a piston, pushing contaminated air further and further. The Underground's enclosed tunnels and enormous daily passenger throughput made it, in the language of the report, an ideal vector for widespread contamination. The commuters on those trains were never told. Not that day, not that year, not that decade. And the Underground trial was just one piece of a much larger program. Between 1940 and 79, Porton Down conducted over 100 open-air biological and chemical trials across the United Kingdom. From 1955 to 63, aircraft flew along the south and west coast of England from the northeast all the way to Cornwall, releasing zinc-cadmium sulfite over the population below. Between 1961 and 1968, more than 1 million people along the south coast from Torquay to the New Forest were exposed to bacterial agents including E. coli and Bacillus globigii, sprayed from ships in Lyme Bay. Military personnel who encountered curious members of the public were given a cover story. They were told to say the trials were research projects into weather patterns and air pollution. When details of these programs finally emerged in the late 1990s and early 2000s through Freedom of Information requests and parliamentary questions, local councils in Dorset demanded a public inquiry. The government refused. Instead, they commissioned a review which concluded that some individuals with chronic health conditions might have been affected. might have been affected after spraying live bacteria over the populated area for 2 decades. In 2002, a Ministry of Defense report acknowledged the trials and stated that the substances used had posed no danger to public health. The phrasing, once again, was familiar: no danger to public health. The word Maralinga means thunder, though not in the language of the people who lived there. It was borrowed from an extinct language spoken 1,000 miles away. The British chose the name. They did not ask the Maralinga Tiarutia people, the traditional custodians of that desert land, for permission to use it. They didn't ask permission for much of anything. In 1955, the Australian Prime Minister Robert Menzies received a request from Britain. The UK needed a permanent site to test nuclear weapons. Australia's vast, sparsely populated interior was ideal. Menzies agreed without consulting his cabinet, without requesting health assessments, and without considering the people who already lived on that land. Between 1956 and 1963, the British conducted 7 major nuclear tests at Maralinga, plus roughly 550 so-called minor trials, basically tests of nuclear weapon components, and in the end, it generated far more contamination than the bombs themselves. Plutonium was scattered across the desert. The minor trials alone distributed an estimated 22 kilograms of plutonium across the test site. That material has a half-life of 24,000 years. The Maralinga Tiarutia people had lived on that land for millennia. When the government seized it, some families were forcibly relocated to missions at Yulata, hundreds of kilometers away. But the relocation was rushed, incomplete, and some families were simply left behind. There are documented cases of Aboriginal families sheltering behind sand dunes during a detonation, watching the sky darken, inhaling the dust with no protective equipment and no warning. One naval patrol officer, one man, Walter McDougall, was responsible for clearing Aboriginal people from hundreds of thousands of square kilometers of desert. It was an impossible task, and he knew it. To keep people away from the test sites, authorities told Aboriginal communities that the desert was inhabited by a wanampi, dangerous rainbow serpent spirits. The noise of the nuclear detonations were attributed to the wanampi. The invisible danger of radiation was explained as spirits. A survivor, named Yami Lester, who was a young man living with the community when the test took place, lost his sight. He spent decades fighting for recognition. Another survivor recalled returning to the land years later and finding nothing alive. No trees, no grass, no kangaroos. When she told a government worker she'd visited the site, the response was, "Oh, you shouldn't be there, it's still pretty hot." But nobody told her. The Australian servicemen stationed at Maralinga weren't treated much better. They wore shorts, shirts, and hats. Some were ordered to stand with their backs to the blast and press their palms over their eyes. Some pilots were ordered to fly through the mushroom cloud. Their radiation exposure was never mentioned. The first cleanup attempt was 1967. The McClelland Royal Commission in 1985 found it was woefully inadequate. Significant radiation hazards still existed across the site. A second cleanup was completed in 2000 at a cost of 108 million Australian dollars. In 2009, most of the land was returned to the Maralinga Tiarutia people. The government declared it safe to walk, camp, and hunt. But in 2001, an international team of scientists found that radioactive particles persist in the soil. Natural desert processes are slowly releasing plutonium. It is being absorbed by wildlife. 46 square kilometers remains designated as accessible but definitely not habitable. In 1994, the Australian government paid the Maralinga Tiarutia people $13.5 million in compensation. For their land, for their health, for their dead. The British government contributed £20 million towards the cleanup, but in 2013 a UK court ruled that veterans could not sue for compensation because they could not prove their illnesses were caused by radiation exposure. The court acknowledged this was almost impossible to prove. That was the point. And through it all, through the testing, the contamination, the displacement, the cancer, the blindness, the dead desert. How the hell do you kill a desert? The official line from both governments was the same. No Australian lives would be endangered. So here's the pattern, and it's not a complicated one. In fact, its simplicity is the most disturbing thing about it. Step 1. Identify a city or population, preferably one that is either unaware, powerless, or remote enough that complaints will be slow to surface. Step 2. Conduct the experiments and use what you believe to be harmless agents, or what you're willing to call harmless, and if any real risk exists, just classify the details and proceed anyway. Step 3. When questions arise, and they will probably arise, sometimes immediately, sometimes decades later, deploy the phrase, or one of its cousins, no danger to the public. No health risk anticipated. These substances posed no threat. No Australian lives would be endangered. Step 4. Classify the evidence. Deny freedom of information requests for as long as legally possible. When forced to release documents, just redact the sections that are inconvenient to you. Step 5. When the lawsuits come, invoke sovereign immunity. When the health claims come, point to the absence of the very study you never conducted. And when the survivors organise, just wait them out, because when you've irradiated them, time is somewhat on your side, and not theirs. This video covered 5 cities, but between 1949 and 1979, American and British military programs conducted hundreds of open-air tests. In Minneapolis, in Winnipeg, in Norfolk, in New York, along the Pennsylvania Turnpike, across the south coast of England, over Dorset, and in the Australian desert. The complete list has never been fully disclosed. The reason this matters is not because it's history. It's because every one of these programs operated on the same assumption, that secrecy was more important than consent, and the phrase no danger to the public was not a finding, it was a strategy. And if you're watching this from a city, any city, understand this. The only reason you know these stories today is because someone filed a request, or someone broke their silence, or a journalist wouldn't let it go. In every case, the truth was never volunteered. It was extracted. Normally decades late, and over the objections of the people who had written those 5 words in the first place. No danger to the public. That's what they said every single time.